Thank you for that. That was really fascinating, and we are running a bit behind time, but I'm hoping we can get through a lot of the topics here. And just on AI, I guess, Rick, we might as well come straight on to you. It's a brilliant segue because Rick here is from Microsoft, and a lot of the talks that you give are all around disruption and how digital disruption is going to, is it going to take people's jobs, AI? And I guess my question to you is, how can AI be a really powerful enabler? We talked about the workforce shortages that we're going to face. Is there a possible solution there in AI somewhere?
Great to see everyone, and thanks for the question. So, yeah, I'm Rick. I'm the Chief Technology Officer for Microsoft Australia, New Zealand, just so you know who I am. And yes, we do talk a lot about AI. There's probably two parts to that question, but I'll go over the last part. We have an aging workforce, which I think is no surprise to anyone. We also have challenges in heavy industry sectors where we struggle to employ or attract younger generations, particularly graduates. And both of those give us challenges. With the aging workforce, we have the challenge that we lose a lot of tacit knowledge, particularly when people retire. There's also the challenge that we're not just going to get rid of people because they're aging. And as we look towards an energy transition, we need to reskill or repurpose using different types of technologies. We also want to make sure that we can attract the right type of next generation to help with that transition. So there are ways to augment some of that, I would say. And artificial intelligence, particularly generative AI, is one of the ways to do that. And we've been doing that for some time. I was actually in Melbourne yesterday working with one of Australia's largest energy providers. And we had the conversation around how can we use AI to go specifically on this topic. So on the kind of loss of tacit knowledge, we're actually able to do this, and we have projects live at the moment where we can digitize some of that tacit knowledge that we might lose, put that into knowledge bases, and then we can use generative AI to use human language queries to go across the top of that. So someone that's got no experience of, say, things like wind turbine operation, you could actually look at a data set and you could ask it using human language to say, is this wind turbine operating within parameters? What sort of things can I do to make sure that it's doing things in a better way? And you can leverage some of that tacit knowledge that's come in that you may not have as an individual. So that's one example. For the attracting the younger workforce, probably another example, and I think this was kind of coming up with the gaps in the skills pathways. There is a lot of capability around data science, modeling and so on. Bringing that into an organization which doesn't necessarily have those skills, but has huge swathes of data in terms of the operational transmission grid, the distribution grid, power generation, whatever it is, bringing those skills in and actually creating models using generative AI to provide queries on top of those data sets means that someone new into the organization can actually start to say straight away on day one, I've got these types of analytical skills, but if I was to look at a particular problem for the best place to put renewable energy sources into a transmission grid, where would that actually be? So we can use generative AI to augment the human being, to fill in some of those gaps that we would have around kind of the aging workforce or attracting the next workforce to come through.
And I guess right now there's probably that gap of how do we get people to interface with AI, because I think that we've got prompt engineers and all of that kind of those kinds of roles that are coming to the fore. So I think how do we interface with that is probably a short to medium term type of issue as well. Is that something that you're experiencing?
The new job titles is a really interesting one for me. We're working with, I know it's not an energy transition, we're working with a leading supermarket in Australia at the moment. And they've actually got this new job title, which is it's the AI chatbot design engineer. And all they're doing is designing the personality for the chatbot.
Wow.
So they've come up with 3 different things to allow people to interface with it, giving it a personality. So wow. I think we're going to see more and more capabilities around generative AI. I would say generative AI is still at its infancy though.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff still developing. We still don't have what I would call solid reasoning, sentiment, problem solving. It's coming there in smaller language models and that sort of capability, but there's a long way to go before the Terminator comes, takes all our jobs. Yeah. And we really see general AI, which is where machines and humans act in exactly the same way as humans do. So I think we're still at the early phases.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you. And apologies, I didn't introduce you. I'm just feeling so anxious and excited about everything running to time. So apologies for that. Rick? Thank you for introducing yourself. I will introduce you, Jacqueline. Jacqueline is, along with Danny, they're both very valued industry advisory board members for the Digital Grid Futures Institute. And Jacqueline has just recently been seconded from Energy Consumers Australia as their Director of Policy over to Federal DQ, where you're going to be working on the Consumer Energy Roadmap. And Danny, you are of New Energy Nexus, and I think you have just established a stake in New Energy Nexus Singapore more recently. You're based in the States, so thank you so much. I won't pretend that you come in just for this event, but thank you so much for joining us. And you've obviously had a lot of experience in the US and bring that perspective as to what's going on there. So I'd love for you to share some of those insights a bit later. But on that chatbot issue, I just want to come to you, Jacqueline, because as a customer, I am on with chatbots probably more than I speak to humans. To be honest, I actually quite enjoy it because I don't want to have to pick up the phone and it's quite convenient. But so when we have that consumer lens, what are you hearing from consumers about their perceptions of the energy transition, how it's affecting them? Of course, we're going through a cost of living crisis, had to have energy bill rebates. What's your sort of finger on the pulse of what's going on in the energy, in the consumer heads of the customers, energy consumers, which of course is all of us?
Yeah, so when we think about the energy transition, and we've heard a lot today already, it's very much around the big end of town. It's around how do we build the wind farms, the solar farms, how do we get them connected into the grid? The flip side is there are 5 million households, there are 15 million internal combustion cars right now on the roads that all need to be converted if we're going to get to this net zero future that governments have all committed us to. We don't get there unless we bring consumers with us on this journey. So we have to work with them. And in my mind, that opens up a world of opportunity for jobs and for students and people to transition into this sector. There's probably not a sector in this university that wouldn't be applicable in the energy sector. The consumer experience in this sector is going to be critical. Right now, we see a real lack of trust in the sector. And consumers are seeing prices going up. They're seeing solar panels going in, but they're not really sure how that works. Can I export my energy? Do I have to pay to export my energy now? What does it mean? All the rules are changing. And so I think what we're seeing from consumers is a lack of trust, a lot of confusion, and not a lot of clear messaging from people. So how do we bring them with us on this journey? I think that's where there's a lot of opportunity for everyone in this room, for all of us, frankly. We need lawyers, we need communicators, we need people who can advocate for the variety of consumers that are out there, people who are in First Nations communities, in rural communities, people who are not speaking English as a first language. All of these people are going to need help to make this transition, and we don't meet our net zero goals unless we do that.
Yeah, and I think DGFI was established back in 2019, and it really was very much a technical problem. How do we integrate renewables into the grid? And I think it's really shifted hugely now. And I think a lot of people are scrambling with how do we get the social license? How do we get, but you need experience with that. And especially if we talk about rural and the First Nations aspects, how do we get the expertise, and knowledge of people who can deal with that delicately and, in an appropriate way. So, yeah. Danny, I guess your perspective in the US, we could argue that they're probably a few years ahead of us in a lot of ways. Obviously, they had the IRA Act, which is only a couple of years old. But how have you seen that impact how renewable energy projects are taking off, and accordingly how the jobs and their ability to deliver on those projects has been? Just
to be real about the US now that we've had a change of government, elect at least. I'm not sure they're a couple of years ahead. I think Australia is a postcard from the future for the US in many regards, particularly the penetration of distributed renewable assets and consumer-owned assets, which is an interesting financing point that I think Angela made really well, how much of this is actually going to be a financial engineering piece and problem compared to the 20th century energy structures, which were either publicly owned or corporate owned assets. 25% or something of a mature, advanced energy transition economy is a household financed thing, which is interesting. But to your question, sure, the IRA created a pulse of activity which, compared to the population size, is about on par with Australia, well behind China and many other countries actually. But nonetheless, particularly upstream in manufacturing led to a boom. And the same problem was identified, a huge skills gap. We need 1 million electricians in the United States to do the things we claim to do. We need, in California, 17,000 line engineers for factories that we have commissioned to do batteries, theoretically. Whether or not they will now be built is another question. So, there has been massive workforce development initiatives led by the Department of Energy. Something called the Green Jobs Office at the DOE was established in the period since the CHIPS and the IRA Acts were passed. And they have been, working particularly with community colleges across the country, which is sort of the TAFE system. And, there's been a boon in education, but to Hamish's point, still somewhat siloed, still somewhat trying to sort of skill up new punks to get into the game rather than transitioning across skilled workers, not taking some of the tips and tricks that Dr. Hua described. And, I'm not going to suggest that you look to America for learnings about those things, honestly. I would, I mean, the phenomena that I think is most interesting in this game, aside Australia, is, in the current calendar year, probably Pakistan and how the hell they did 12 gigawatts of photovoltaics in a country that prior to the year had 2.
Wow.
And the answer is electrical contractors self-trained on the internet, broadly speaking. And then China in 2019 decided that big solar and wind farms in western deserts weren't enough and the eastern seaboard cities had to have distributed renewables as well. And in a year, they went from less than 10 gigawatts of rooftop to something like 70 gigawatts of rooftop. And how did they do that? How did they integrate that into existing grids? What did they do with power electronics? How did they get workers and people? And by the way, in China, those are actually household financed assets also, largely, those rooftop systems or commercial and industrial ownership of those assets. So the financial engineers, the local banks, the local credit institutions also worked out how to do that. So I think if we're looking for stories to learn from, don't just go across the Pacific.
Right. Yeah. I guess the reason I ask is because the inspiration for partly for Hua's project came from the DOB website, where they did actually have career sort of pathways mapping, and they seem to be quite proactive in that.
I'm not trying to poo-poo my friends. I'm just trying to be real with y'all.
Yeah.
That's what we say in the States.
Okay, that suits your moustache beautifully, that accent. Thank you.
It's Movember, just for anyone that wants to sponsor a mustache.
Actually, while you've got the mic, you've recently not recently, but about a month ago, there was New York Climate Week, and you were on a similar panel talking about green skills and data from LinkedIn, actually. And I don't know if many people know that Microsoft actually owns LinkedIn. What can you share from that? Because I think were you on the panel, or?
Angela already put a slide up with all the right data points.
Oh, yeah.
It's that, they and Student Energy globally have done a bunch of this mapping and thinking and found that young people think they've got to have STEM, which they don't.
Yeah.
Think that there aren't enough of these skilling type course offerings and modules to allow them to jump out of one career into another to get the cross-disciplinary piece. The conversation at Climate Week was very similar to this one, a desperate need for redressing those things and educating students in STEM, yes, but also not in STEM, that there is an enormous world. Like, this is the biggest historic lift we're going to undertake this century to rewire the world.
Yeah.
And all of us and all careers will be engaged in it to some degree.
Great, thank you. We actually had a meeting recently with the Faculty of Arts, Design and Architecture, and they're actually developing a skills passport, and we've had conversations with them where they say, well, if I've done a philosophy degree, what role can I play? Or if I've done a media or arts degree, what role can I play? So those sorts of activities, I think, will really help, like a skills passport, so they can actually draw a very clear line. between what they're learning and the industry. Rick, I'll come back to you. One thing that you mentioned to me, which I hadn't really thought about, was the sort of gap of what sustainability commitments a lot of governments and entities have actually committed to without necessarily having considered the workforce size. So are you able to expand on that a little bit? And yeah, just the sustainability gap.
Yeah, so if we take a little bit of a journey back 4 years to when Microsoft launched our sustainability commitments, if you haven't read them, have a look on the internet. They're pretty moonshot, including like by 2050 wanting to have removed all carbon we've ever produced as an organization. So we don't know how to get there yet. We're working on that one. But we've got a whole range of commitments. But one of the things we identified very quickly was that there was a skills gap inside of our organization and across all sectors to actually, to your point, help us with that transition. So we identified that in 2022, Microsoft and BCG, the Boston Consultancy Group, we created a study report. We went across multiple businesses in different industries, and it was all around where are we with that sustainability skills gap, and it had actually grown. So even though many organizations had put in commitments, we started to see regulation policy growing. The actual gap between where we were in the sustainability skill sets to close that gap had actually grown. I was with Ernst & Young in New Zealand last week. We did a tour with multiple customers, and it's actually grown even wider since then. So it's this kind of continuous gap that we're seeing. So I think that's one of the challenges that we're going to see. But when we actually look at that report that came out in 2022, it's even further compounded by the fact that there's also a shortage of digital and data skills. And the top 10 skills that are required for sustainability, actually 5 of those are digital and data-based. And the number 1 is how we can actually collect, manage, and get insights from data. So if we have this sustainability skills gap and a digital skills gap, what do we actually do to actually close that, knowing that it's going in different directions? This will be an even bigger challenge for Australia next year when the government sets its policy and its pathways for 2035 targets. That'll happen next year, so it's going to be something we have to address. 2 things did come out in that report, though, which for me are just blindingly obvious. The first one is really looking at how we can start to create persona-based skills across different industries. So I wouldn't necessarily say things like just how we do cross-skilling, but how do we create the right persona-based skills across different industry sectors? That's the first one. And the second one is we don't have any internationally recognized sustainability certifications. So why aren't we creating these certifications that really then might attract people to go in, study, get those certifications, and start to build up that skill set, but making sure those certifications are aligned directly to some of the gaps that we actually have.
Yeah, a bit like B Corp certification, and yeah, I think it's Jeff Dimery, another board member of ours, had said if only there was the same level of social license to build renewable energy projects as there was to shut down coal-fire power stations. So yeah, it's that gap, I guess, is across the board really. Jacqueline, how much do you actually need to know about the energy sector to work in the energy sector?
Almost nothing.
Yeah, I was going to say. Yeah.
So I did do maths at university some years ago now for a semester. I hated maths. I genuinely hated maths, and I still ended up in the energy sector. Yeah. I did a climate science degree at university. I did that back when climate science was still being debated about whether that was a genuine thing or not. So that ages me a little. But I genuinely have almost next to nothing in terms of my background, and yet still feel like I make an impact every day. At Energy Consumers Australia, we have a staff of 25. We're a small organisation, 25 FTE. We make substantive impact in the policy sphere in particular, and that flows through and it impacts on everybody's day-to-day lives and how they work, how they live, how they operate their small businesses. I have hired a number of the staff over my years at ECA, and the sorts of skills that I bring into that organisation are almost always not STEM-based. I've got people in there with government and policy experience. I've got people in there with behavioural sciences experience. All of these skills, which are not seen as being traditional science-based or energy-based skills in particular, they're all valued. We need lawyers, we need behavioural scientists, we need communicators who can talk to people and help them on this journey. So it's everyone.
So how did you go from climate science, so just quickly chat through a chronology of your career? So you studied climate science and you're now doing policy.
Yeah, so I like a lot of people that I've spoken to who've been in the energy sector for a while now, most of us didn't mean to be in the energy sector, and if we did, we certainly didn't mean to be in it for this long. It's really fun, it's really interesting, and the challenge has been there and it's kept me interested. But yeah, I studied at uni, I did atmospheric science and finished that university. Because I hated maths, because I didn't do any of the computer modelling or any of the traditional skills that would help you go and work for the Bureau of Meteorology, I kind of got a bit stuck. And I ended up working in the energy sector for one of the pipeline management companies and doing a very technical short-term piece that was just sort of looking at some of the documentation. And I just found that so fascinating. And I ended up moving from there into their head office and then staying in the energy sector. So I've done a range of mostly public policy roles over my career. Mostly I've worked for the rulemaking body, the Australian Energy Market Commission. I've worked for New South Wales Government, now the Commonwealth, and energy consumers in the middle, and just love it.
Yeah, I think that your answer is pretty common, is by accident. Is the short answer, isn't it? I think a lot of people, and I guess that's what we're trying to do is, sort of short circuit that and accelerate it. Danny, you are the one who inspired me or encouraged me to explore student energy as an entity. How important do you think their role is globally? I know they started out in Canada, where a lot of youth were sort of seeing a future taken away from them in oil and gas space, I think, in Canada. And I think it came out of that sort of environment, and I think one could argue that it's a similar situation here. So how important do you think?
Yeah, I think it is a similar situation here. I mean, as I understand the genesis story, Hamish might know better, but I know some of the founders of Student Energy in Canada. They were sitting in Alberta and University of Calgary and only getting offered hydrocarbon engineering courses. And they were sitting there going, we don't want to do that. We don't want to be in that career. Oil sands is not the future. We know that. It's killing us and our children's prospects. And they didn't get offered any more courses than petroleum engineering. And so they went and self-organized and started running courses themselves. And that's kind of the bread and butter of these 50,000 members of student energy chapters across the globe. I've met students in Nigeria, in Indonesia, in Mexico, all around the world in the last 6-7 years, doing that kind of energy transition, skilling themselves, but then also partnering with like-minded academics in universities elsewhere, which is wonderful. I think, they're a critical organization in this movement, or whatever we call ourselves, market and movement. The revolution that is undergoing in the energy space is going to be led, like all revolutions, by student vanguards, in my imagination of it. And so I think this organization is critical. So kudos to the crew to get it going here at UNSW, which has been a vanguard institution in the Australian energy transition and the world's, with its particular skills in photovoltaics and other power electronics. But I think we'll get even more value for all this wonderful skill with a good student organization.
Yeah, awesome. Am I on? Yes. Amazing. So I'm going to come back to you, Rick. When someone told me that when Yasminka introduced me to you, she said, I really want to find someone who at Microsoft who is interested in clean energy. I have to admit, I didn't really see that as a strategic imperative for Microsoft, but I know that you do a lot in the future of workspace and obviously education space. So can you tell us a bit about what Microsoft is doing in the clean energy space, and why in particular you're interested in this as a CTO?
Yeah, so I think Microsoft have made a whole load of commitments. The only way we're going to make or achieve our commitments is by focusing on clean energy, low carbon energy sources. So I'd say first of all, we are currently, I think, the most valuable organization on the planet. And I think with that, it's not just an opportunity to speak out and do the right thing. We have an obligation to actually speak out and do the right thing. But we spend a lot of time in terms of doing programs like skilling, which I think is really important for what we're talking about today. We typically look at Microsoft's responsibilities in 3 areas. What can we do for ourselves as an organization to reduce our own sustainability footprint? what can we do to help customers and industry, and then really use that voice for what can we do for policy, much more around planet and society. But on those first two, so in terms of employee skilling, we, back in 2020, when we made our announcements, we created a new ERG group, which was the Sustainability Connected Community. So we actually created a group, global group, and there's just over 10,000 members as part of that group today. They're actually actively encouraged to work together, share information, and actually go out to get time off work to go out and do sustainability-based projects. At the same time, we launched an internal training program on sustainability science, and our employees are actually certified to get a Sustainability in Action badge. On the back of that, we've had nearly 15,000 people trained actually on that course itself. So we kind of have that skilling. And then last year, before I moved into my new role, I was actually part of the global sustainability team. I actually created and launched a course working with ERM, Environmental Resource Managers. They're the largest sustainability consultancy in the world. And that was really focused on going much deeper on what does sustainability actually mean for particular industries, and what does it mean around decarbonisation and sustainability reporting, but what is the role of data and digital technology? So we actually broadcast live to over 2,300 people across a day, and that's now been packaged up. So there's a whole load of stuff we're doing to drive our own skilling workforce. And that second thing, though, what do we do with customers and industry? So we have a Sustainability Academy that's been launched. It's free public training. If anyone wants to see the link, ping me on LinkedIn. I can provide them to that. You can register for it, and that's free. We've made our commitments to train, I don't know how many million people it is around the world, on digital and data skills as well as sustainability, and that's a commitment we make at government level. We've done that in this country as well. So that's another thing that we do externally. And we also work with organisations like TAFE to build those digital data and sustainability skilling programs as well. Cool. So I think we've got a commitment in terms of what we want to do, but we can only get where we need to be by having people knowledgeable and skilled up to help with that transition.
Yeah, and I think... And I sort of tic-tac with Hua on some jobs that I find. I geek out sometimes on LinkedIn and seek just to see what jobs are out there. And you see, Amazon, AWS, Microsoft, Atlassian, so many companies out there who you wouldn't typically think are, have an energy imperative, but of course they're all energy consumers, and they're all recruiting, clean energy managers, energy reporting managers, environmental sustainability managers, and so on. So I think, again, that context of the skills is as important as, just saying that we're in the clean energy sector. So, Jacqueline, I wanted to come back to you because you touched on behavioral science, and I don't know if you've read my notes, but I think part of what I'm seeing, and I experienced it myself being a consumer, is that it's actually quite inconvenient and quite disruptive. And it actually, even though I work in the sector, getting my head around, what an inverter is, how to use a specific app, or I, had range anxiety when I was on a trip to Canberra recently, and nothing's just sort of seemed to work together. How, in your consumer energy roadmap, how are you tackling all of these sorts of almost educational and awareness type of aspects rather than the adoption? I guess there's all of that, awareness that needs to happen beforehand.
Oh, you have tapped into my passion projects here now, Sharon, so strap in, everyone. A couple of things that I would say in response to that. One, I think one of the biggest challenges in the energy sector right now is we as I said before, we can't get to our net zero targets without bringing consumers with us. But the energy sector, and particularly policymaking at the moment, is predicated on what we tend to call our imaginary friend. It's the person who's going to respond to a price signal, or the person who's going to allow an engineering solution to be imposed upon them. And they rarely work. And when you start rolling these out into the real world, people will push back. You might see it there's been a lot of media articles over the last 18 months or so about either cost-reflective tariffs or the sun tax, as you might have heard, the tax on the export tariffs applied to solar exports. It's not helpful, and it really it sows that distrust in the sector. The other thing is we see sort of the engineering and the pricing solutions being engineered to create a consumer response to a problem that is just not practical. So I watched one of our New South Wales networks at once. One of my team sat in a working group with a bunch of consumers where they were talking to them about what this energy future looks like. And they were saying, we're moving to a future with renewable energy. It means that there's going to be times of abundance and times of scarcity. You might need to change when you use some of your products. And the participant looked at them and said, oh, well, so what you're asking me to do now is to shift some of my load in the middle of the day. So maybe I do my washing in the middle of the day now when the sun's shining. And the researcher was like, absolutely, that's exactly what we're asking you to do. And she said, but I don't work from home. Yeah. So even if I schedule my washing machine to run in the middle of the day, the clothes then sit in the machine wet all day until I come home and put them in the dryer. That's not the solution we're looking for here. So behavioural science is key to designing these products and services that are going to work with consumers and work in their lives so that we can bring those together. The ISP, the most recent ISP, is estimated, I think it's something like $4 billion worth of savings if we can make sure that we are, I hate this word, orchestrating, but using consumers' devices in a way that works well and integrates well into the system. That's an awful lot of money.
Yeah, and I think, as I say, just so inconvenient. And when you think about the changes that people have to make in order, and I think we're relying a lot on consumers to be a part of the solution as well. Danny, did you want to say something?
I was just going to say that all those things sound like opportunities to me. Yeah. Like I've spent the last decade training and investing in over 1,000 startups in this space. And, every one of those things is a business innovation problem. And like my fixation was there's not enough entrepreneurs. Now it's becoming clear there's not enough employees for the entrepreneurs to engage in the transition. But the entrepreneurs should just look at that and look at the savings and work out how to make that an attractive bundle and a business model. So there's a lot here that is good too, not just challenges.
It's amazing, and I think that's what I was really excited about Hua's work was, how much can we unlock if we take a very crude view of just looking at skills rather than expecting a lot of people to have experience. But I think that's probably going to be an issue for the legacy industries because they have to change. It's not like they're, like a Tesla who's just come in with, with everything and not having to retrofit. So I think, there's a lot to consider there. We've run out of time, unfortunately, but I wanted to leave a few minutes for questions. If anyone has any questions. Oh, here we go. Yep. It uses, yeah. 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 That's a good. I'm sure, Rick, you've got some.
It is. So I'm currently working with the Climate Leaders Coalition at the moment. I'm one of their delegate members, and we're driving an initiative. Microsoft are actually leading it to look at the impact of AI on sustainability and then the opportunities for AI to help with the sustainable transition. And I'll cover both of those off very briefly. You're completely right. No matter what we do with AI or any other data service, it's going to drive more energy consumption. So we have to make sure that what we're doing is using renewable or low carbon energy sources to do that, and also making sure that we're not taking that load off the grid. We're creating net new additive as well. So we just opened our new data center in New Zealand. All of the power for that is it's hydro-based, and it's all net new additive. So we're not increasing any carbon emissions as a result of that from an energy perspective. There are other challenges around embodied carbon, scope 3 in the concrete and in the steel and so on in the data centers. We're now building our first wooden data center, believe it or not. So that's actually a project that's going live as we speak. In terms of so all of Microsoft data centers, anything that's new runs on zero carbon or low carbon fuel. By 2025, even all of our existing ones will be in exactly the same space. Any of our new data centers, there's no water used for cooling. It's all alternative liquid cooling. So I think there are lots of things we can do to mitigate. I'd also say that if you look at a lot of the research out there at the moment, it talks about the comparison between, say, doing a normal Google internet search query versus, say, a ChatGPT or something like that. It's around 33 times as intense, although the reality is if you put a good query into ChatGPT, you'll get a really good response back versus taking 30 queries in Google to find what you want. So, but there's new NVIDIA chips that are coming out now, which have already reduced that power consumption by 25%. And there are a lot of things we're doing in software. So I'd say we don't yet know what the impact of AI is going to be, because we're not running AI at scale anywhere around the world. It's lots of smaller projects, but it is going to grow. But I would say, in order for us to get to any pathway, sorry, I'm passionate about this. In order for us to get to any kind of pathway for the energy transition, the only way we're going to be able to model those pathways is through the use of artificial intelligence. We can't not do it. So we've got to get that balance between looking at the opportunity for AI to deliver sustainable outcomes, as well as making sure we mitigate as much as possible any of that sort of impact. But it's a spot-on question to ask.
Brilliant.
I'm dealing with this a lot in the States these days. And yes, the compute electricity demand is growing and may double or triple or quadruple. We don't know yet, and we haven't yet done the innovation things we can do with the chips and the centers and the systems. And then there's Asian air conditioning, which is going to grow way faster and far bigger, because we're boiling the planet with global warming, and people need air conditioning to survive. And there's 2 billion of them that can afford it and will buy it. And then there's African leapfrogging to energy services like we take for granted. And if they do it with diesel, which is their current broad integrated resource plant, forget it if they do it with clean. So I think we've got to get, kind of a little perspective on what the problem is. I for sure think we should demand that Microsoft and Google and everyone do it with renewables and do it with only new. And then we go and deal with the energy transition where the demand is driving emissions into the atmosphere, which is not that, actually.
Yeah. And I think that's what, John, you've always reminded us about the new grid, and when we electrify transport and we electrify so many other things, and, as you say, more air conditioning and whatever, is you basically have to multiply the grid by an exponential amount. Like, you need to build it multiple times over to cater for all of that, to replace fossil fuels. So it's pretty scary, but you're excited by the opportunity, right? Okay. Yeah.
Just on that as well, if you actually, the IEMA produced a report earlier this year which looked at overall data center for any service. It's between 1 to 2% of overall energy consumption. So exactly to Danny's point, and they predict by 2030 it might double up to 4%. That's a fraction compared to the amount that's actually done from heavy industry. So we do have to put it into perspective, but we still have to do our part to minimize everything we can.
Yeah. Cool. Yes, Benji, hi.
I'll go first, just to say, from that Climate Week event in New York, the big takeaway was mentorship was actually something that people called for, like, giving young people exposure, from actuarial studies to, we've got a bunch of engineers trying to struggle with this weird distributed grid that's going bi-directional all of a sudden, and we don't know whether it's going to fry the inverter. How do you do the calc on the insurance policy for that? And getting young people out of their siloed academic institutions and into the real world, struggling with all this stuff, is one answer at least.
I think it probably goes beyond work integrated learning. I think, internships and things like that. And I think that's one thing, Hamish, we talked about in our strategy session was, how can we do masterclasses for students with guest speakers, from industry or, from lecturers, so that we can have, target it by subject, for want of a better, approach, so that we can help them, sort of have that visibility of stuff that's available. Jacqueline, do you have anything to add?
I was just going to say that from ECA's perspective, so being a consumer advocacy organisation, is a little different and it's a little bit more challenging, I think. But they're a small organisation, and I should be clear, I'm not speaking with an ECA hat on anymore, but because I'm now sitting in the Commonwealth. But I know that their experience is actually, it's a more practical piece. So it's one of the functions of that organisation is a grants-based function, and many of their grants go to research organisations to build up the skills and to build up the practice and the knowledge. So I think there's an element there that we're doing to work with the research sector to try and help bridge some of those gaps. And that organisation gets involved as well in each of those projects to help draw some of those links together where we see opportunities to connect different sectors, different ways of thinking into that space.
Amazing, thank you. Rick, do you have anything to add to that?
I'd say we're already doing quite a bit in terms of building those types of courses. We deliver hackathons, but I'd actually love for universities to actually engage with us perhaps more, because we're certainly, there's a little fly here, I'm not just going mad here at the stage, little fly there. So, but I'd love to, well, I welcome these opportunities to be able to come in, but really talk about real examples of where we're doing this sort of work. So like, we talk about cross-collaboration. I've been working on projects like Zero Carbon Humber in Europe. It's the largest industrial cluster in Europe, and it's all around cross-sectoral collaboration. What did it take to actually do that? What was the role of tech? What would the role of students in different disciplines actually look like in that? So I'd love to be able to come in and talk more, as would many people inside of Microsoft do that. I'd love for people to just reach out to us. Yeah, brilliant. Well, we'll take you up on that because, I think we're always hungry for industry perspectives, and a lot of the seed-funded projects that we're going to be running next year. Jacqueline, I've hit you up for some ideas of, we've got someone who's working in AI and cyber and privacy. So I've just said, actually, and he's saying, how can you, how can I help? How can I build a project out of this? And, I'm hitting up Jacqueline for, for ideas in that. So I think, thank you for that. We'll definitely think about that. I think there's definitely a role for Microsoft. And I think you've got such a huge, future of work imperative, haven't you? I mean, you're really heavily invested in that space. So, yeah. Amazing. Peter, have you got any questions?
No, look, I've very much...
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks for joining us.
Enjoyed everything, and well done to you all. It's such a great deal of opportunities, I think, for not just UNSW, but the education sector. We've got some massive challenges facing us from every quarter, and the electricity growth, the consumption we're talking about is vital for everything to do with health and the quality of life and whatnot. So together we can solve it, but if we keep on arguing about whether this type of energy or that should be permissible, as Australia has got its no nuclear policy, we don't open, there's a lot that we should be helping all of the policymakers in trying to figure out which way we go and how do we get there.
Brilliant. Thank you. Excellent. Oh, we've got one more question.
Just wholehearted agreement. And the word ecology was used, which is actually my discipline from academic training. And I think that's what we're missing, is a real ecological systems view of these systems that we're trying to fix. We have a dumb grid inherited from 20th century technologies that didn't work very well, and we're trying to make it smart while flying the plane with billions of people on it, and that requires a lot of complex problem solving. And worldview or mindset, whatever you call that, will be needed to change, along with institutions like universities, but government bureaucracies, market regulators, all the things need to change to adapt to the technology that we're bringing in.
I'd probably just add on to that to say that I think there are lots of different individual movements trying to address the problem in their own different way or different silos, exactly to your point. I really think that we need to get some firm direction from policy regulation that says, in order to solve this challenge, we are going to have to do this. And until we actually get that, I don't think we'll get all of those different groups working as collaboratively together as they should have. We need a bit more an incentive and a stick as well.
Thank you, all. Any closing words? No?
It's everybody's responsibility, so let's all play our part. There's just no doubt about that.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much for speaking. I've got a little gift for you, and there's some drinks and food, I think, available at the back there. So please do stay, mingle, and talk and share.